Well, today we are starting at the beginning of our church. Our church wasn't founded until May of 1832, but I imagine talk of establishing a new church by members of the Northeast Presbyterian Church had already begun by the beginning of that year. The population of Harborcreek Township had recently doubled, and there were no established churches between Northeast and Wesleyville. Things were a lot different then. Travel was difficult. There were no paved roads, no cars. Instead, you traveled by horseback or you walked. Imagine walking to Northeast for church this morning. You'd pass small farms with mostly log cabins and small clearings. Farming was difficult, hacking through the underbrush and cutting down the trees, no chainsaws to use, and then there was digging out tree stumps and digging out tree stumps for days on end. This was the wilderness. Yet people saw a need for a place to worship God in Harborcreek, thus avoiding that long trip to Northeast. So 58 members of the Northeast Church decided to go make a new church to the west in Harborcreek. The members met at first in the barns of William Wilson and Elder J.M. Moorhead until the church could be built just east of the current village of Harborcreek on land donated by Judah Colt, a member of the Northeast Church. There was no village in Harborcreek at that time. The first two ministers pastored both the Northeast Church and the new church, and from 1832 to 1834. By 1834, the Harborcreek Church had grown by 32 more members, showing that the new church was needed in Harborcreek. It was a plain brick structure, 35 by 40 feet, with 2 tiers of windows, a high pulpit, and higher galleries on 3 sides. There were pews with high sides to sit in for an annual fee ranging from $2.50 to $28, depending on the location of the pew. There were also free benches called slips that you could sit on in the center of the sanctuary. That structure, which cost $2,039.19, was built and located where the post office is today in Harborcreek. It was dedicated on May 26, 1832. We were thrilled to find a description of the inside of our first church, written by Abby Elliott, the daughter of Reverend George Washington Cleveland, for the church's centennial celebration in 1932. Here's what she had to say. "I wish you could see the inside of that old brick church as I see it tonight. The high shut-in pulpit, the congregation facing the entrance doors, the square pews on each side. Ours was a conventional slip in the center. On the rare occasions when I was allowed to sit in one of those box pews with a cushion at my back and a foot stove to warm my feet, a door to shut us in, and Father aloft preaching for all he was worth, I tell you, I felt as if I was booked straight through for heaven." Our church had grown significantly after George Washington Cleveland was called to be pastor in 1849, with a religious revival occurring that year. Subsequent revivals occurred in 1858 and 1866. During the latter, 74 people joined the church. That's pretty remarkable for a community in the rural area at that time. It's not surprising that there was talk of building a new church after that year. The building was 30 years old, it needed some repairs, and it was getting crowded. A fire in the spring of 1869 made the need for a new building a critical issue. Being good Presbyterians, a committee was formed to study the options. Should the church be rebuilt at the same site? A village was growing around the new railroad station in Harborcreek, and some people wanted to move the church closer to that station. We also had a large number of members who lived in Moorheadville, 2.5 miles to the east, and the manse for our pastor was located there. Perhaps that's where the new church should be. The committee decided to poll the residents of both neighborhoods regarding their location preference. The majority would win. Samuel Moorhead and John Dodge were elected to take the formal vote of interested people in Moorheadville and Harborcreek. April 10, 1869, the results were in. Those in favor of relocating to Moorheadville were 52 members, 6 people who attended but had not joined yet, and 6 non-members, for a total of 64 votes. For a Harborcreek location, the vote was 50 members, 28 attenders, and 8 non-members for a total of 86 votes. Harborcreek had won. Unfortunately, the Moorheadville faction refused to be a part of building a new church in the Harborcreek village. They certainly had to be concerned about the future of their own village and their businesses after the addition of that railroad station in Harborcreek. And John Dodge, he was a prominent person in this new village, owning land on both sides of the street from what is now Bartlett Road to the proposed location of the new church. That land included several houses in addition to his farm and his brand new business, the Dodge Shingle and Handle Mill. Reverend Cleveland, who had supported moving the church to the village, offered to resign on June 4th, 1869. But the trustees felt that the loss of the pastor would only make matters worse. Discussions continued until May of the following year about what to do. At that time, Joseph Moorhead visited the disaffected members' homes to see if they would be willing to support rebuilding the church at the original site. He obviously was a Moorhead who wanted to keep the church together. Their reply, though, was that they declined to support the Harborcreek Church at either site. The Joseph Moorheads, as well as James Moorhead's family and Calvin Leet's family, were the only Moorheadville residents that we know of who chose to remain with the Harborcreek Church. By 1871, many of the other members had transferred their memberships to Northeast. On May 14, 1870, the trustees accepted the gift of land in the village from John Dodge, and the Harborcreek Presbyterian Church had a new location, the site we are gathered in to worship today.
Last week, we talked about our first church building, which was located where the post office now stands, that burned to the ground at the time discussions were taking place about the need for a new, larger church building. Eventually, a new brick church was built right here in the village of Harborcreek. In 1870, it cost around $10,000. The picture, do we have a picture? Yes, this picture shows what it looked like. Unfortunately, though, again, fire struck the church on May 2nd, 1917. Reverend James Waite was leaving our church, and members of his family were burning trash and old mattresses in the yard just west of the church. The fire got out of control and spread to the nearby horse barn. Then the fire, spurred by a strong northwest wind, jumped to the roof and the tall steeple over the church. Calls were made to the 2 Northeast fire companies and also the Erie Fire Service. The children at Central School, which was located to the front of the lot where the water tower stands today, were sent home to bring back buckets and form a bucket brigade between the church and the creek, just west of today's car lot. My mother was a first grader at the time. Imagine passing buckets of water trying to put out a fire up on the church roof. The wait for the fire engine, pulled by horses, seemed to be endless to her. Her arms got so tired. Finally, they could hear the sound of the horses coming from Northeast, running as fast as they could. But the small pumper fire engine did no better at fighting the flames than the bucket brigade had. Afterwards, only 3 usable brick walls remained standing. Everything else was lost, except for the church bell, the furnace, and a brand new cast iron stove that had recently been installed in a remodeled kitchen by the Ladies' Aid Society. It was determined that $16,000 was needed to rebuild. Our church had no debts. $100 in the treasury plus $100 the Ladies' Aid Society had left over after the kitchen remodeling. There was also an $800 endowment available for use, but it was still a long ways from the $16,000 needed, especially when the average weekly pledge in those days was 50 cents. The decision was made to rebuild, and just like good Presbyterians, 4 committees were formed. The session members were the executive committee. There was also an 11-member building committee, and a men's team and a women's team with 10 members each. All of the committees were charged with raising as much money as possible, as soon as possible, so the rebuilding could begin. Between June 25th and June 30th, the team members contacted every member asking for pledges. Their outreach was also extended to the people of the village. A table was manned at Central School each day and evening that week, complete with a local phone connection so people in the area could call to contribute. Throughout the summer, team members also manned a table for contributions at all of the events held at the Exhibition Fairground on Iroquois Avenue. A total of $10,000 was raised, and a loan for $6,000 was obtained from the Presbyterian. Meanwhile, other church members were busily cleaning up the ruins at the church. Fallen bricks were sorted and cleaned. Bricks were also collected from the burned-out Circus Soup Kitchen on Troop Road to enlarge the new building for future growth. The original building ended where our balcony begins at the back of the church today. Although less obvious after the recent brick repointing, you could still see evidence of the fire in some blackened bricks on the front and the sides of the church exterior. Worship services were held at Central School while the work was progressing, and candidates for pastor were leading the services. On September 16, 1917, Reverend Charles Highfield was voted to be the new pastor. He would conduct the first service in the new church building on March 31, 1918. The total cost of the new building was $16,032.97. On the 86th anniversary of the church's founding, May 26, 1918, the new building was dedicated. The church bell had been cleaned and rehung to announce the worship services. The bell would also have a new duty as the fire alarm for the village. Two of our church members, Walt Shaner and Ross Wood, had recognized another great need in the wake of the fire. On weekends and evenings throughout the summer of 1917, the two men had worked to build a cement block building just beyond the creek on the south side of Buffalo Road in the village. You can't miss it. It's now painted a very bright orange. When it was finished, they began asking for donations to purchase a used fire truck, so our community would never have to watch another place in our village burn down while waiting for the fire trucks to come from Northeast and Erie. The Harborcreek Volunteer Fire Department was founded through the efforts of these two men. Rebuilding our church in such a short time was quite an undertaking. It's likely that some had felt the rebuilding of the church would be too hard or cost too much or take too much time and effort for it to even be possible. But faithful hearts were willing to see beyond the problems to what God could do if they would work together to see the project through. And God provided solutions that not only gave us the new, bigger building for worship, but benefited the whole community as well as the new fire department. I've left some things on the back table concerning the fire, pictures of the building after the fire, but we were kind of concerned to find that one of the pictures we do have of the building that actually shows the collapsed walls is missing from the history cabinet in the back of the church. If you know of its whereabouts, we'd really appreciate it. It would be returned to the case. But please stop after church and take a look at the things we have there. We didn't have any pews at first. We just had chairs. And one of the things is a very delightful little poem that somebody wrote about contributing money for the pews in 1922, I think it was.
We thought today we would be appropriate time to talk about music in our church. A member of our church in the mid-1800s, Joseph Smith, mentioned in his journal that there was a choir of 6, 1 man and 5 women. He also described the cabinet organ, which had been recently purchased on June 23, 1867, as being too loud, which drowned out the words of the hymns. Accompaniment for music was still controversial in those days. Abby Elliott, in her Memories of the Church, wrote, James R. Moorhead had been in charge of the music from always until long after the new church was built. She adds that his wife and later 3 daughters also served in the choir. The daughter of our minister, Reverend Warshness, was elected organist each year at the congregational meetings during his term with us. Later in the 1920s, our church also had an orchestra which provided music under the direction of Mr. Miles. We are uncertain of how often, but an orchestra performed at least occasionally as late as the 1940s. And I think there's a picture somewhere where you can see the orchestra like up in the balcony, I think, in the cabinet somewhere. I have that memory. Where was I? In February of 1929, the purchase of our present pipe organ was authorized. What a difference a few months may have made. After the stock market crash of October 1929, the purchase of an organ would have been delayed for many years. The congregation had a hard time finding money to pay for the pastor during the Great Depression, and an organ would have been unthinkable. As in an article published in the Erie newspaper in 1941 about a Sunday morning visit to our church by columnist Arch Bristow, noted that Mrs. Inez Uber is an excellent organist who brings out the beauty of the grand old doxology with the life and vigor with which it should be played. Life and vigor for the doxology, right? And that the Harborcreek Presbyterians sing well. Aww. And that was back in the 40s. He also wrote that Reverend Stammer did an unusual thing. He would turn his back to the congregation and conduct it as a choir maestro and minister in one. In the 1950s and 60s, our choir flourished under the direction of Bill Wood. They were accompanied by a succession of organists, including Karen Keene, Marnie Highhouse, who is now Marnie Logan, Linda Holden, now D'Angelo, and Nancy Smith, now McNally. Nancy and Linda returned later to serve our church as accompanist for many years, and they still provide piano and organ duets for us on special occasions, such as today. Another feature of the 1960s was a large children's choir. There were so many children that there were 2 children choirs for a while. We also experimented with contemporary music for services with the John Lupke Art Orchestra, making several appearances in 1966 and 1967. In October 1975, Chris Thomas became our music director. Besides directing our adult choir and the Sunday school children's choir, Chris began the bell choir in 1995, which I can sort of remember. Cindy Skladinowski shared the experience at our last anniversary. She said, "I remember the very first bell choir rehearsal with Chris and Bill Wood showing us how to play them. We were so green, but somehow we got it together enough to play, and they played Jesus Loves Me. It was the first song." Chris also finds a variety of special music when the choir takes a break for the summer months. And during the pandemic, she has provided many, many solos for the worship services herself, which we are grateful for. During the pandemic, Jared Mosier recorded the special music for services with the harmonizers, the bell choir, and various soloists. And Jasmine Mosier is one of our favorites playing on the violin. Some of these videos are available through our church website under special music videos or on our YouTube channel. The pandemic also inspired some choir members to take on the challenge of singing in the virtual choir. We all should thank Bill Nascoda for all the time he has spent blending the individual voices so skillfully. And our last year's Christmas cantata was watched as far away from as India, so we are internationally known. Bill Nascoda has also provided the guitar music for our occasional folk choir performances for many years. Today is Music Appreciation Sunday, which began in 1993 with only the chancel choir singing. Over the year, the performances have included the bell choir and various young people using their talent singing, playing trumpet, violin, or piano. Once Pastor Russ Van Antwerpen even accompanied the choir on trombone. Of course, there have been many piano and organ duets contributed by Linda and Nancy as well. We've been blessed with so many talented musicians over the years, and we've come a long way musically since our new cabinet organ and choir of 6 in 1867.
We have been looking at a bit of our church history for the past 3 weeks to celebrate. But to celebrate what? Well, everything, I guess. The 58 people who came here to make a new church in Harborcreek didn't leave much of a record behind as to why they began this church. I guess when you live in the wilderness, you're too busy being the church to sit around writing about it. The only clue we have of the spiritual goals of the early Presbyterians, which was the first denomination to bring the gospel to Erie County, by the way, is a quote from the very first Presbyterian church at Middlebrook, which was located on Route 89 between Colt Station and Wattsburg. A brief speech was made when construction of that log church began in 1801. We must have a house of worship. The Lord will be with us if we serve him. We can assume the 58 people who started our church were of the same mind. As we said before, there was no Harborcreek village when they came, just farms that had been hacked out of the wilderness. Until the church was built, they worshiped in barns, and then they carried on the work of being the church. By the way, at least 4 of those Middlebrook Presbyterians have descendants in our church today. Dave Maley, Chris Thomas, Claudia Brown, my sister, myself, and Joyce. While I can't tell you what their connections are specifically to that church, William Wilson, who had provided the barn to hold worship services in our early days, had been a member of that Middlebrook church before moving to Harborcreek. He was my mother's great-great-great-grandfather. The Harborcreek Church was the mission field of the Presbyterian Church until 1861, when the members took on the total support of the pastor on their own. Afterwards, we had a long history of support of the work of missions through the Ladies' Aid and missionary societies, and later the Presbyterian women did a lot of mission work, but we are still continuing missions beyond just the 4 annual denominational offerings with our support of the food pantry and other local missions with contributions from our annual fundraisers. We provide meals occasionally for the upper room. Recently, our church participated in a backpack food project for local school students, and before that, there was a reading program until that pesky pandemic interfered. And of course, our blessings cupboard has helped some of those with food shortage issues since the pandemic began. These things are an important part of being the church in Harborcreek. I have to mention Reverend Cleveland again. He came to the frontier to do the missionary work of leading our worship services and stayed in Harborcreek for 44 years. An interesting man who missed only one Sunday of leading worship in those 44 years, the day after he had been struck by lightning in 1865. Yeah. The following year, he led a revival that brought 74 new members into the church. That was described as remarkable for a country parish. The need for a larger church brought a split, but we can greatly admire the people who worked so hard to straighten the situation out without rancor. The church continued to grow and thrive in its new location in the village. There were, however, ups and downs of the fortune of the church depending on economic times. Some remarkable sacrifices were made by pastors to outlast tough times. My mother had great respect for Reverend Stebbins, who was the pastor from 1930 to 1938. She said it was a wonder that he and his wife did not starve, as his salary was cut again and again and again during the Great Depression. Reverend Cleveland also had survived a lean period. His salary went from $700 in 1878 to $342.55 in 1883. They were holding church dinners to raise the funds to pay him. Our forefathers and mothers were persistent people. Other churches had come and gone in Harborcreek Township since 1832. Although there's no record of it, when our church building burned in 1917, I don't think there was any real question about rebuilding. There were only 2 churches in the township at the time, ours and South Harborcreek Methodist. We rolled up our sleeves, raised funds, cleaned the bricks, and rebuilt the church. Then we survived the Great Depression and grew again. I love the bulletin from 1953 that has the slogan across the top, where old-fashioned friendliness still survives. It's one of our themes. Over and over again in church newsletters and people's comments, you hear what a welcoming church we have been. In the 1990s, to make the building more welcoming, a new entry was added with easier access to the offices, an elevator for people challenged by stairs, an upstairs restroom, as well as a youth room in the basement. We have had a strong interest in young people. In 1896, 2 years before Reverend Cleveland died, he was very encouraged by the increase in interest among the young people of the township. In the 1930s, a new Sunday school class was added because they were concerned about the gap and difficulty between the junior department and the high school class. Church picnics were held for the children each summer at Orchard Beach in Northeast and were well attended. In the 1950s, we began working on the plans for our Christian education building. Those dividers used to mark off the different classes in the church basement just wouldn't do. Audio-visual materials were purchased to keep up with changes in technology to reach children. Anyone remember film strips with records playing the narration? When we later got the film projector, it was a great improvement. In the 1970s, family camping weekends were held. A church mouse wrote a section for children in the newsletter. In the 1980s, we had a clown ministry which even put on programs for other churches, and children's sermons were added to the worship services. We have had a long history of ministering to children and youth in many other ways too, including vacation Bible schools and student-led worship services. One other consistent interest is in music. What worship service would be the same without the music? Right, Robin? We've worked for a long time to provide a variety of music, developing young people's musical talents, and we've even held special musical events from time to time. There isn't enough time this morning to mention all the different things that members have done over all the years to be the church in Harborcreek. So let us just celebrate all of the 190 years before this and know that God is smiling on us in our house of worship as we do. In 1832, God called things that be not as though they were. 58 people heard that voice calling and came to bring the gospel to this place. As we celebrate, may we hear his voice still speaking new things to us. And afterwards, let us go out and serve Jesus, so he will be with us not only here in 2022, but as we go on being the Presbyterian Church in Harborcreek for years to come.